Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to call this meeting to order of the Mayor and Board of Commissioners for October the 12th, 2021. Can I get the roll call, please?
Commissioner Braun,
Here.
Commissioner Warnick,
Here.
Commissioner Pearson,
Here.
Commissioner Shepard. Let the record show that you do have a quorum.
Thank you. And Commissioner Shepard had let myself and the board know that he had a work commitment this evening and was unable to make it. Will you rise with me for the Pledge of Allegiance, please? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Will you bow your heads with me for a brief prayer? Father God, I come to you tonight on behalf of our town, God. I ask that you watch over our Board of Commissioners. I ask that you watch over our staff and our employees, Lord. Please be with our citizens, be with our armed forces, the first responders, the fire department, Lord. Watch over our troops here and overseas, Lord. Be with us as we're here this evening and as we leave. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, we don't have any public presentation items. We do have a few business meeting items. Town Administrator, do you have the MS4 Stormwater Management Illicit Discharge Ordinance?
Yes. So what you actually have tonight is not an ordinance for presentation. It's basically a boilerplate sample of an MS4 ordinance that we need to adopt. Let me back up and say that basically MS4, the way I like to describe it is MS4 has to do with stormwater management. And over the last decade or so, you've heard people refer to reducing your carbon footprint. They always encourage you to reduce your carbon footprint. Stormwater management is sort of the same concept, that they want communities to reduce the footprint of the amount of what you would consider contaminants that get into, in our case, the Chesapeake Bay. And we know that the Chesapeake Bay is a vital economic engine for the state of Maryland with all the fishing. So it is important that the state of Maryland do its part, along with other states in the area, to try to eliminate pollutants that get in to the Chesapeake Bay. So that's sort of a 10,000-foot view of what MS4 and the stormwater management is. Now, over the years, MS4 has been around for a while, but it was slowly being incorporated into what I'm going to call as mainstream, in terms of larger communities had to comply with MS4, and the smaller communities were given a certain amount of time or time in the future of when they would come into compliance. I don't know this for sure, but I believe there's actually some communities with very small populations that will never have an MS4 requirement. However, some of the restrictions that are in place that we're going to be talking about tonight would most likely be managed by the counties in which those very small communities are located in. So for instance, right now, the county and the town of Elkton have been under the MS4 requirements for, a couple of years now. More recently, Northeast, Perryville, and the town of Rising Sun reached the threshold of where we had to come into compliance, whereas communities like Chesapeake City and Cecilton at the very least, and I believe Charlestown, do not have any MS4 requirements. I'm not sure about Port Deposit. But I'm just giving the example of how you slowly have to ratchet up. So if you recall in the last 2 years' budgets, especially last year's budget, I talked about some of what really is an unfunded mandate in terms of what we are required to do. We still have that big cost of about $1.75 million that we are projected to have to spend by December of 2025 to do our portion of reducing our footprint, our stormwater footprint by 20% is the magic number. We're not really talking about that tonight, but I wanted to give you, to remind you of the general idea of what this all covers. So we had to start filling out, doing reports 2 years ago. We're getting ready to complete our third year report that's due by October 31st. We have KCI has been charged with doing all the necessary paperwork for that. We've had some assignments that we've had to do. For instance, our staff had to sit through some training on stormwater management. If you recall back at Sunfest, we did a public outreach for stormwater management. And among the other things is we have to adopt what is called an illicit discharge ordinance. And basically, in a nutshell, what that is doing is basically creating an ordinance that we are charged with enforcing to make sure that the stuff that is bad doesn't end up into the stormwater and get down into the drains and then get out into the Chesapeake Bay. That could be stuff that's done by accident, you know, in terms of some kind of rupture of a tank or something like that. It could be things that people just don't know any better, and that's why our public education is so important. And then there are things where people are doing it deliberately. You know, accident is sort of self-explanatory in what an accident would be, but someone doing something that they know they shouldn't be doing could be some kind of business that instead of paying the cost for the disposal of something that they're supposed to be disposing of, they just maybe drain it into a sump pump that drains out, you know, into a pump out into the parking lot and goes down into the stormwater drain. That would be something that is, you know, an egregious illicit discharge. The other thing where public education comes into play is there are certain things that our residents could be doing that they're not aware how dangerous that can be. I've never seen anybody do it, but I've heard the stories of, you know, you change your oil filter in your car and you drain the oil out of it and then just go over to the stormwater drain and dump it down the stormwater drain. You can be taking your pool out of service. Let's say you're going to drain it down or to prepare for the winter, to winterize it, or you might be getting rid of the pool in its entirety. If you dump that water out with a high chlorine level, what you would normally have to be able to safely swim in it, that would be considered an illicit discharge. What I sent you last week was basically the boilerplates with the idea that I wanted you folks to take a look at it, because you do have some latitude to either add some things that you don't want to, you know, some that are in one category you can move to another. For instance, if there was a section about what is permitted. You might decide that you don't think that that should be permitted, period, and you could move it up into the other category. So with that, I think it's important that I just quickly go over this, because this might be one of our best opportunities for our residents to see this. And let me back up and say this. We're not doing the Zoom to the public as we decided at the last meeting. Zoom is being used for our consultants. We've advertised that people can click on our website and go to the town's YouTube channel to watch the meetings live. So Dennis is live streaming on YouTube. Unfortunately, we don't really have any way of knowing how many people are watching it at that time. So the template that you guys had, and this is sort of a summary, and we could probably use this summary to put out as public information after we adopt the ordinance. Again, we're not looking to adopt it tonight. I just wanted you guys to have a conversation. I will put this into our standard ordinance format for our next town meeting. So the objectives of the
Can I
ordinance.
ask a question, Calvin?
Yes.
Do we have to read the new ordinance in its entirety?
Well, just to be clear, we're not introducing the
No, we're
ordinance
not
tonight. Okay.
introducing it tonight, I'm asking. Do we have to read it in its entirety?
I believe, I mean, we have the town attorney on. My impression in the past has been we just technically read the summary of the ordinance and then make the
That's what I
ordinance
wanted to
available.
make sure,
And then
because,
publish it.
yeah, because if we started reading this ordinance in 5 minutes, people are gonna be
Yeah.
sound asleep.
Yeah,
You know, I mean, that's just, I just wanted to get clear on
Yeah, I keep
that.
it on my nightstand, get through a few pages a night.
right. So, some of the highlights of it, the purpose and intent is basically what I talked about. I like to look at it in a simple way, is we're trying to reduce, on one hand, we're trying to reduce our community's impact with, contaminants or things that are not good for aquatic life getting into our streams and into the Chesapeake Bay. So, basically some of the highlights of the purpose and the intent is to regulate the contribution of pollutants to the MS4 by stormwater discharge by any user, prohibit illicit discharge and connections to the MS4. And when they're talking about MS4, that's the acronym for the stormwater system in the town. Prevent non-stormwater discharges generated as a result of spills, inappropriate dumping or disposal. To establish legal authority to carry out all inspection, surveillance, and monitoring procedures necessary to ensure compliance with this ordinance. I want to back up and make sure that people realize this is something that's coming out of the federal clean water ordinance or clean water law. It's a federal requirement, and the feds pass it on to the states, and then the states pass it to the counties and the local municipalities. So we don't have any choice in this matter. We have to adopt this or some semblance of it. This is coming out of the Clean Water Act, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, and any subsequent amendments thereto. That's what's driving this. Illicit connections. This ordinance basically is going to cover things that are connected to the stormwater system that allow bad things to get into the stormwater system. Now, when we talk about connections, we're not always talking about a hard pipe going from point A to point B. It could be a hard pipe dumping out on the pavement and then the pavement draining to a stormwater drain. So it's not, when they talk about connections, you don't physically have to see a connection for it to be an improper connection. Any drain or conveyance connected from a commercial or industrial land use to the storm drain system, which has not been documented in plans, maps, or equivalent records and approved by an authorized enforcement agency. So what that basically means is, just like in building permits, a commercial or industrial processing can't just say, well, we don't need a building permit for this. We're going to deal with this stuff by hooking this stuff up and discharging it. They would have to come in and get a permit to actually get permission to handle those processes or those items in that matter. So that's what this illicit discharge, the two main areas that it's going to cover. You have the items that are prohibited, strictly prohibited from discharging into the stormwater. There's a total of 20 of them. They're pretty much self-explanatory. They would be things like wastewater. They would, on commercial property, cleaning a parking lot, the chemicals can't be discharged, out on the parking lot. They have to get them, collect those and make it so they can't get into the stormwater. Car washes themselves, although you don't really see that too much anymore. You can't have a commercial car wash and just have people with a hose spraying the cars down. Even at the one we have in town, there's a whole filtration system underneath that recollects that water and separates the contaminants out and actually reuses it in the car washing process. So a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory. But there are other things, like let's say there was a salvage yard, and we have a lot of those in Cecil County. I'm not sure if I don't think we have any in the incorporated limits of the town, but you go by a junkyard that has old cars sitting on it. Technically, that water that falls on those cars or that salvage yard is supposed to be contained on site. It's not permitted to drain out. It's not even really permitted to leach into the ground and pick up underground streams to be able to get into it. So that's an example of things that people might not realize or into your MS4 or into your stormwater system. Um, Water line flushing performed by a government agency. And so what that means is when we have, when we flush our fire hydrants as a government entity, we're allowed to open up a fire hydrant and flush the water line out to get contaminants, or sedimentation is really the right word, sedimentation out of the system. That's permitted to go into the stormwater. Diverted stream flows, sometimes there's circumstances after you get the proper permits that you might take a stream and have portions of it diverted into the stormwater system. Maybe it's an overflow that diverts into it because of a rain event. Rising groundwater, in other words, we just had it in Hurricane Ida. You wouldn't go to a property owner necessarily whose stormwater management pond was just totally overwhelmed by that once every 500-year flood, and we only make them design it for a 100-year flood. You're not going to necessarily cite them for an illicit discharge because the stormwater ponds overflowed and then we're able to get into the streams. Foundation drains. So if you have a foundation under a house or under a building that's just collecting rainwater and you're keeping it out of your basement, that can be discharged out onto the ground. We talked in the past about in our wastewater treatment facility, we have a problem with what we've called I&I, and sump pumps being illegally connected to our wastewater system. Well, if they can't be connected to the wastewater system, where do they go? They would go out into your yard. This is basically saying that is permitted to drain into your stormwater. And with all of these things that are listed here under exempt, there's 17 of them. I believe you would have the ability to move some of these up to the non-exempt category if you wanted to be more strict. But when we talk about foundation drains, it doesn't mean that you can have a leaking oil tank in your basement that leaks and then you just have it run into the sump pump and dump it out into your yard. So you're allowed to discharge, natural rainwater that gets into a foundation, but any contaminants that it comes in contact, you can't just turn a blind eye to that and have it go out into the stormwater. So it's a lot of common sense. The last item, number 15, I talked about it. If you're draining out your swimming pool, you got to make sure the chlorination levels are down, that there's really no chlorine residual at all in the water before you drain it out. This is something that I want to, this is applicable to a lot of the codes that we have, and I want to take the opportunity to clarify this. In any code, our zoning code, our building codes, there's always language that says right of entry, and that means that a code officer, an enforcement agency, has the right to enter the property to do the inspection, but that doesn't mean that you don't have the right to deny that entry. And that's what the next line is saying, is that prior to inspection, the code officer must make reasonable efforts to locate the owner or other persons having charge or control of the structure or premise to request entry. If entry is refused or not obtained, the code official is authorized to pursue recourse as provided by law. So what that's basically saying is if we wanted to go to a location on private property that was illegally discharging, we would get permission to do that. If they deny us, we would go to court and say to the judge, this ordinance says we have the right to enter the property. At that point, if the request for entry is reasonable with a reasonable law, then the judge should say, yes, I'm going to grant that permission to go. So whenever you see language in a code that says the code officer has right of entry, doesn't mean they can, just supersede your rights as a property owner. It just means that they would have to go to court and make that argument that the ordinance is what gives me as a code officer the right to go there, and the judge would determine if it's a reasonable request or not. So I just wanted to bring that up because that's pretty applicable to a lot of different codes, whether it be planning, zoning, stormwater, or general building and code enforcement. Anytime somebody gets a violation notice, just like in the zoning code or in the building codes or the property maintenance codes, the property owner or the offendant has the right, the defendant or the one who's violating the law has the right to appeal that, and they can basically put a stay on the enforcement actions that take place. So they have a right to come in and appeal, and basically, you know, like any other code, they're not allowed to say, I don't think that was enough gasoline to warrant the code officer coming on the site. They could come in and say, well, what I'm discharging is whatever, let's be silly, chocolate milk or something like that. If the code officer were to say, well, I think that's a stormwater discharge, the property owner would have the right to come in and appeal to an appeals board stating that the code officer is not properly applying the law and the intent of the law. And that holds true with zoning codes, you know, building codes, code enforcement, so forth and so on. The other thing that's common in other types of codes is the cost of abatement. So in other words, if you've gone through all the proper violations and you've gone to court, if that's the next step, and somebody refuses to correct the violation, you have the right to have those violations corrected. You can hire a contractor. You know, you're typically probably going to have to get a court order at that point to take contractors on somebody's property. Again, you get the blessing of the court. You have the right to pass those costs plus administrative charges on to the property owner. This is common in most of your codes. The one thing that is relatively different about this stormwater is that in lieu of a fine, you can actually require the defendant to attend stormwater education classes on something. You know, maybe it's a really minor violation, and instead of giving them a whatever $50 fine or whatever it is, you say in lieu of the fine, we want you to attend this, you know, seminar or whatever on stormwater management or some other type of educational thing. And then the last thing is that if you fail to clean the violation up and you fail to pay any of the fines or citations on that, you can be, the end person, the defendant, can be held to criminal prosecution by law. Again, you would file, you know, citations and go into court, and the judge can find them guilty. Again, this is a federal law. So it's not meant to do scare tactics. I've said this before. In my world of code enforcement and zoning, I always think that it's more of an accomplishment to get people to recognize why they should be doing something as opposed to holding a code book over their head and threatening all kinds of violations and citations. I tend to believe that if you've reached a point where you're issuing all that stuff, at the end of the day, you're sort of losing the battle. I'd much rather be able to educate people on the benefits of this than to be issuing citations. So that's basically the boilerplate. This is what will show up in the ordinance when I present it, and I just wanted to give the board the opportunity to weigh in on that if there's any questions you had or any changes that you wanted to make.
Any questions?
Not after having read it before.
All right, thank you, Town Administrator. Moving forward into handicap parking space.
So what I wanted to introduce is the concept of handicap parking spaces. And Commissioner Pearson, I didn't get a chance to follow up with you because it's just, in doing some research, I realized that when we passed our handicap parking ordinance, it was restricted to residential properties. It's not open. In other words, a commercial property cannot petition to get a handicap parking space. A residential property can. And the theory behind that is, first of all, on the residential side, the way our ordinance is written, you have to show a doctor's note that you need that. Your property has to be something that if you were handicapped, having a handicapped parking space makes sense. Now, let me qualify that in saying that a lot of times people view a handicapped parking space is simply for someone who is bound to a wheelchair. It could be someone who struggles to walk. It could be someone who has COPD and they can't walk far distances. It could be a variety of reasons why somebody gets a handicapped parking space. So on the residential side, you don't really see that here in Rising Sun, but if somebody had 15 steps up to their front door, or 15 steps up to their back door, giving them a handicapped parking space doesn't really satisfy anything, because if, the idea would be if they can make it 15 steps up, front or back, what is a handicapped parking space gonna do? With the idea that parking in residential areas are a premium, and if you start allocating handicapped parking spaces out in a very lax manner, you could end up having a lot of handicapped parking spaces on a residential street. So just because a residential property applies doesn't mean they're necessarily gonna qualify for it. But the other idea is that on a residential property, you can relatively enforce the fact that the handicapped parking space in front of that property is for that property, not for everybody else. And that's the situation we have down in Valley View, where we have the one and only handicapped space that we've ever issued down in Valley View, because there are limited spaces in front of each one of those townhouses, so that one property owner petitions to get it. They maintain that parking space, they pay for it to be painted, they pay for an annual license to get that. It's like $25. It's a nominal charge, but they have to take ownership of that, and they can, by rights, lay claim to the fact that that is for them. If you were to issue handicapped parking spaces in a non-residential area, then what business is going to feel that that is their handicapped parking space? And would you want to be in a position where if you had 10 businesses on a main street and every single one of them said, well, I want a handicapped parking space, well, then you start to cut down on the parking that's available. And in that paradigm, you would also want to potentially not think about giving handicapped parking spaces to a commercial property that has the ability to provide for that handicapped parking on their facility. So let's look at that a little bit closer. Let's just hypothetically say that you could park on Main Street. I'm going to be real egregious when I say this. You could park on Main Street in front of Martin's. It wouldn't make sense for the McDonald's or a business right out there to say, well, we want somebody to be able to park out on Main Street because it's closer to our building. No, you have off-street parking. You provide that handicap parking on your lot. So what I think I would recommend that there is a need for some handicap parking in our business areas, but I think we should actually look and come up with where that handicap parking should be and how much of that handicap parking that we provide for. Otherwise, we can inadvertently create unintended consequences of issuing one without any criteria in place, and then being open to everybody coming in and wanting handicap parking. So basically what I'm suggesting is, for the interest that we have received, is that we set some kind of criteria, just like we do everything else, and if the following criteria exist, then the elected body would move forward with issuing a handicap parking. So that would be my recommendation to avoid unintended consequences. I had a conversation with the town attorney today, and he's about this, and he's on the meeting. So if you will, if he unmutes his mic, we can hear his viewpoint on this endeavor also.
Thanks, Calvin. I mean, I don't need to expand too much on what Calvin said. Everybody, it's good to see you this evening. When you're dealing with a commercial use, it's not covered by your current ordinance. So that's pretty simple. And it wouldn't meet any of the criteria that the current ordinance would require, so you got to do something different. and you're worried about the unintended consequences. If every business asked for it, you wouldn't have any parking in front of any business. So you need to do it strategically, and since you're really controlling the public right-of-ways, you come up with a process to do it. As I talked to Calvin earlier, it's not simply the parking space. It's no good if you have a parking space, but you don't have a curb cut that you can get up, or you don't have signs, or you have like a telephone pole in the way. So it has to make sense, which means you just can't do it. You have to look into doing it, but at the end, it's possible.
The other thing that I would add, and I don't want to get too far into details on it because it was an inquiry. There are other ways to accomplish the same thing. If you have a particular business that has, at least more than one parking space available in a lot, they could put the handicap parking in their lot, and we could put no time limited parking of an hour or 2 hours in front of that business there. So you can accomplish the same thing by moving out vehicles that are sitting in front of businesses that are not frequenting those businesses and tying up the available parking. So there are some other things that we could do to accommodate those types of requests.
So, Calvin, if I'm hearing you correctly, the conversation's to be continued.
Yes.
Okay.
And I'd like to get some guidance from the board on what they'd like us to look at.
I don't think anyone would have an issue with Calvin and the town attorney speaking about which is the best way to handle this as far as Main Street goes and that type of
Any business districts?
a business district.
Yeah.
Okay. Moving forward into citizens' input. Would anyone in the audience like to speak this evening? All right. Office Manager, do you have a report?
I do. I have a brief report. I just want to remind everyone about the election on October the 18th. We did not receive any requests for absentee ballots, so that window has closed. That window closed on October the 8th. We're still very much active in Planning Spectacular. It's going to be a great event this year. We've got a lot of interested food vendors looking forward to finalizing everything. And then we do have a new staffing person that will start with us on November the 8th. And we look forward to him joining the staff. And other than that, we've been doing a lot of things a little bit differently, but I don't have anything to report right now.
Thank you. Chief, do you have a report?
I do not have a report for this evening, sir.
Town Administrator, do you have a report this evening?
Yes, I have a couple things. One, I wanted to give an update on the trailer park. The recently, I guess.
And Calvin, just to clarify, this is Mill Creek, correct?
Yes, Mill Creek. That recently, I guess it was the middle of last week or the end of the week before, Governor Hogan had declared a state of emergency. That was as a result of the remnants of Hurricane Ida and the flooding. Although it was a state emergency, it was sort of regulated to a very few counties that seemed to incur the most damage. That was necessary in order to then go to the feds to try to request individual funding. And when I say individual funding, I'm talking about grants. I'm not talking about loans or individual assistance. Although the governor did declare it a state of emergency, the state of Maryland did not qualify for the threshold to receive FEMA funding, individual funding for individual property owners. However, we had, and when I say we, the county through the Department of Emergency Services, they needed to check off that box basically to try to get FEMA funding. The next step is to go through the process of getting financial relief through low interest loans through the Small Business Administration of the state. That does look to be very promising. I know from the site inspections that I participated in, I guess around September 5th or so, maybe a week after the storm had hit, that the reps that we were walking around with were expressing that they saw significant damage that would make at least some of the properties that were subjected to the damage eligible for the low interest loans. We should, in speaking to the county emergency services today, we should be hearing something in about the next week on that. Again, the governor declared the emergency because we needed that to try to get the FEMA funds. However, the dollar amount damage, quite frankly, wasn't high enough to trigger relief from the feds. The other question that has come up is that originally there were 14 families displaced from Mill Creek. There are a lot of rumors going around on what the final disposition is. In talking to the Department of Emergency Services no more than 3 hours ago, all but one family has found housing. They are being provided with housing. There are a couple that are staying with family members. There's one or two that have gotten back up on their feet in other locations. And when I say all but one family, the county just hasn't been able to get a hold of that one remaining family to find out exactly what they are doing. But in all cases, all the families have been provided resources through HUD for rent subsidies to get assistance on paying rent wherever they have to go or paying for hotels. So there's been a lot of services that have been offered to some of the families, and some of them have made the choice to pursue those offerings. Some have probably made the choice that that's not the best route for them and their family, so they've sought others. But we don't have families walking around the town of Rising Sun sleeping in cars with nowhere to go, and that has been some of the rumors that have been out there. The last thing I wanted to bring you up to speed on is the new house on Walnut Street by Jane's Church. That's scheduled to break ground on October 22nd. All the approvals are in order. I've heard some rumblings that they might want to have a little celebration in there, so when I get that information, I will pass it along to you, but I know they're going to be breaking ground on October 22nd for that house. That concludes my report.
Calvin, one thing, going back to the trailers, how many of them are gonna be habitable?
We have not concluded everything that we need to be doing to make that determination. I will tell you that there are under the FEMA, and it's important to note this, I think I had said this to the board before, in order for the town of Rising Sun to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, and you don't necessarily have to be, I don't believe, in a flood area to get the flood insurance. But in order for our residents to be able to do that, we have to adopt, which we did, and enforce a flood zone regulations. So there's a variety of criteria that's going to have to be met for anybody who's been flooded in the trailer park for those trailers to be returned. There's just still a lot of evaluation that has to be done to determine that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Town Attorney, do you have a report this evening?
Good evening, everybody. My report's really brief. We've been working on a bunch of different things that have been pending, but we have to shift focus because there seems to be some movement on the Southern States project. Southern States apparently met with MDE and now is interested in us coming to them with, I call it a final package, but it's an agreement and an understanding, and kind of on their terms, everything has to get worked out now. So we have to be full speed ahead on that because like they want everything yesterday. So we're working on that to the exclusion of everything else.
Thank you. Town Engineer, do you have a report this evening?
Good evening. This is Scott Koenig on behalf of KCI. I have just two brief areas to report on. The first being from the street program side. We have 4 locations, Mason Run Lane, Turtleback Court, Carruthers Street, and a portion of Pearl Street that we finished the concrete work on. We're trying to get the contractor mobilized for milling and paving. We expect that to happen in the next week or so, and as soon as we have an official date, we'll notify the town manager. And they do have a requirement to notify the residents that the paving will happen. We've done some core samples on 2 of the roads, Turtleback Court and Mason Run Lane, to verify that there is not hardly any base asphalt there. And we're gonna make adjustments to the paving section to accommodate for that. And we just have to hit the right window for weather, because we're gonna mill up basically all the pavement on those 2 roads and immediately come back with base pavement and then top coating. So it will be a lot of mobilization, a lot of work in a short period of time, and as soon as we get the contractor squared away with a date, we will begin work. On the water wastewater side, Ryan gave me just a few brief updates. One being that they have been working with the town manager to set up a working CIP map document, and then creating the CIP tracking and funding spreadsheets to match that document, and then also creating a Microsoft Teams site that will improve the communication between internally with KCI and then also with the town and anyone else who's associated with the Microsoft Teams site. The second bullet that Ryan gave me is related to the lagoon at the wastewater treatment plant project. He indicated that they'll be submitting the work forms and also researching potential FEMA brick funding. And I hope Calvin knows what that is, because I don't recognize those abbreviations. So that's the update from KCI. If there's any questions I can answer, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you.
Mayor, there's one thing that I wanted to add, and Scott, you're hearing this for the first time. You and I had a conversation on this. I was able to secure our regular vendor, and he has the materials that are necessary to do the line striping in Valley View. So Scott, I'll contact you tomorrow about taking that item off of the current bid, and we'll have our local guy who does our striping do that, because he has the materials to do it now.
Yep, that's great news.
Thank you. Moving forward into the mayor's report, you may have seen, if you drive by or you came in this evening, our town hall looks great. It was recently decorated by our town manager and our public works crew. A huge shout out to them. I think it looks wonderful. You're going to start to see some spooktacular decor head out as well as we get closer to spooktacular. We're really excited about that. Just a reminder, that is October the 23rd, and that will be from 11 to 4. There'll be activities genuinely for families, but we also are going to have some adult activities. Bog Turtle Brewery is going to have a outdoor beer garden right here on Main Street, and then we'll also be having some other vendors out there as well that we will have. Tomorrow, I am actually going to Rising Sun High School to judge the homecoming hallways. A great sense of normalcy has returned with that, so it was great to see that. And then they've also asked me to attend on Thursday their homecoming rally to give a shout out to the kids. So again, having a little bit of normalcy return after the last year and a half of COVID was pretty great to hear. Myself and the majority of the board attended the 100th year anniversary of the Community Fire Company of Rising Sun. I was able, on behalf of this board and the town of Rising Sun, to present them a donation as well as a plaque in honor of that anniversary. I want to thank the chief. I also want to thank our office manager, Judy Melton, who supplied us with tons of candy. A thank you also to Ramsey Ford, who gave us vehicles to be able to drive during the parade. It was just a wonderful event, and it was great to be able to go out and see so many faces. They had a very large gathering that followed. To see so many fire companies join and become a part of that, it was a really big deal. And I spoke a little bit about the fact that they don't do this for the glory. They certainly don't do it for any money. They genuinely do it to help other human beings in their most vulnerable time. So a huge thank you to the Community Fire Company of Rising Sun and to all of their volunteers. Just a friendly reminder, coming up on this Thursday to Sunday is the Maryland 5-Star, and that is very close to Rising Sun, just in Fair Hill. A couple of board members and myself will be attending the event as well. We look forward to seeing a lot of faces out there and enjoying a few days of different types of equestrian events. That is the end of my report. Moving forward into commissioner comments. Commissioner Braun.
I have no report.
All right. Commissioner Pearson.
First of all, I'd like to say that the centennial for the fire company was really nice. And I can say from the many members that came up to me, they were very appreciative of the donation that the town gave and were very pleased that we would even consider it. With that, I have nothing else.
Commissioner Warnick.
Just the boardwalk at the dog park has been repaired yet again. This time lag bolts were ran through to hold it all in place, and we'll see if it doesn't just rip everything up next time it floods. So hopefully that's not the case, but and we may look at some additional ways to kind of secure that a little bit more to try and keep it from floating up anymore.
All right.
Floating the boardwalk to a whole new level.
You can see the upcoming town events as well as upcoming holidays on our agenda, which is posted online, as well as yard waste and trash recyclables. The next upcoming meeting is October the 26th, 2021. Could I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Oh.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting adjourned.